This is the Gen Y Leaders Podcast. Welcome to the Gen Y Leaders Podcast, where we guide millennials to become the next generation of business leaders and entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Eric Huey, and multiple times a month, we bring you interviews from high-performing millennials who are challenging perceptions and changing expectations of our generation. Our mission is to help you overcome fear, take action, and go confidently in the direction of your dreams. It's time to start preparing now, mainly because 10,000 baby boomers are retiring every day, which will create a vacuum of career opportunities that you've been waiting for. Will you be ready? Brendan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
If you could just start off by telling viewers who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so Brendan Reilly here. I am the Chief Revenue Officer at Lelex Prime. I'm one of the founders. There's three of us that founded Lelex Prime. Richard, Neal, and Dan Scott are the other two co-founders with me. And we are a market research company that helps organizations decode human behavior so they can create better products that people love and better marketing that motivates. So I'm like, Dan and Rich are like, them and their teams are the smart guys in the back of the room, you know, making sure we can execute on things. And I'm just like the guy that goes out and hops on podcasts and makes phone calls.
There's worth to both for sure.
Yeah.
So why Lelex Prime? I mean, what keeps you motivated? Why do that versus anything else?
So I was running a company for the better part of 7 years prior to doing Lelex Prime, and it was called Eon Sports. And what we did is we created virtual reality training software for Major League Baseball and NFL teams. But had a good run with that, and we had exited that company in 2017. And was really just consulting on kind of random projects that interested me for the better part of 2017 into 2018. And Dan had been working with Rich. And so I guess before I go into that, like I've always been like really interested in data and what data can do and expose. I've just always been fascinated by it and have just tried to read every bit of book. And then we'll say in parallel, I've always just been fascinated with humans are crazy. My favorite, classes in college were always like psychology or anthropology or anything that had to do with like understanding the human as not like Brendan, but understanding Brendan as an animal. And like, why are we so weird? Why are we such weird creatures? So kind of those two things, and it was really serendipitous. So Dan is our CEO. Dan's my cousin. And Rich, who's our chief science officer, they had been working on a project with an organization on an RFP for this thing called the Global Pain Initiative. And what they were tasked with uncovering was why are certain pockets of the country, some pockets of the country were being hit really hard with the opioid epidemic, but then other pockets of the country were like relatively left unscathed. And like, how do we understand like why that's happening? Because on paper, these groups of people look exactly the same.
Right.
And so Dan and they had collaborated on that. And Dan called me up one day, and he's a serial entrepreneur here in town. So we've always known kind of like, I've always been impressed with what he's done. I think he's been impressed with what I've done. And we're like, hey, if we ever get an opportunity to collaborate, this would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And so he had seen some of the research that Rich and Rich's methodology that he has employed in his research processes, and he was like blown away. He was like, there's no traditional market research that would ever uncover this. And so he called me up one day. He's like, you've got to meet this guy. I think the three of us could do some really exciting stuff. From there, we've continued to grow, and here we are.
Yeah. That's great, man. It sounds like you're at the crossroads of a lot of things like data and psychology and marketing and whatnot. So that's great.
It was a very painful road. So it you're right. We work in primarily marketing, and the kind of we always find a home in consumer insights, but then we go into product kind of product innovation,
Mm-hmm.
and then marketing. Like, how do I motivate people? Over here is like, how do I create products that are inherently marketable? And then over here is like, and how do I motivate people to choose my peanut butter over, their peanut
Right.
butter?
Would you say that's like your main differentiators? I mean, there's a lot of, when people think of marketing firms or even market research firms, I think there's, like it's kind of a wide net. So I maybe explain a little bit more about like your specific differences of business or offerings to, compared to the other firms out there.
Most market research that is done, and this is changing rapidly, but most market research has been done, has primarily been the same way since radio was invented in like the whenever radio was, like the 20s.
So old you don't even remember.
Yeah. And you had this advent of understanding that you could learn a lot about populations by surveying them and asking them questions. And a lot of the like market research incumbents, like that's still their primary way of getting insights is, hey, let's go ask 1,000 people. And then those 1,000 people are representative of the 330 million Americans.
Right.
And it's, that alone is like, well, that is kind of biased. But then what they do is, even if you like tee it up perfectly, you go by the book of like creating an unbiased survey. People are people, and we have a desire to present ourselves in a very specific way to the world. And that's like part of like who you are right now on this. Like, that's different than when you're just having dinner with your wife. That's one of the ways that surveys can be really biased. But then like even like the temperature of the room, or if you're holding a cold liquid versus a hot liquid, like those things influence our answers. And there's like reams of research that show just how asking people questions, turns out humans don't always do the things that they say they're going to do. So that's kind of like the first difference, is we don't ask anyone questions. Yeah. The second thing is we saw over the last like 5 to 10 years this evolution away from surveying, and I mean that's still a big part of market research, but people are, they still do focus groups and polls. But the other thing is a lot of focus in the last 5 years has been on social media analytics and social media listening, which is really just like, think of it as APIing into Twitter or Facebook's and understanding, oh, LeBron tweeted about Twinkies. Twinkies are going off the, Twinkies are trending right now. And it's a dangerous road to go down, because it's the same thing. People on social media are trying to present. No one, I think Dan said this, like no one shows pictures on social media of them in their backyard picking up dog poop. Like that doesn't happen. Yeah. So it's a false sense of the reality that we're all trying to understand a little bit more about humans. So you had this advent of adoption of like social media listening, and I will say this, both surveys and social media listening have specific places in understanding specific answers to questions. I'm not like slogging them. It's just, sure, those are you can, if those are your like main sources of how you're driving like strategy and market research and getting answers, you are in a very biased, like bad information field. I guess in short, the biggest difference is we provide unbiased insight as to the why behind the behavior. And the quest of market research is really how can you understand the job that this product is hired to do in the different populations that you're trying to sell it into. And so what we're able to do is dissect all of the nuances of what is that really, that motivation, what is the need that population subconsciously or consciously associates with that product. Right. And then if you can understand the needs and the concepts that circle around that product and how to best communicate and create products that solve for it, then you have a winning market research strategy.
Yeah, it's awesome overview. Appreciate that. So I'm about to ask you a question. I think you can answer it one of either way based on some of the stuff you've said so far in the interview. But all things considered, do you believe data drives storytelling, or that storytelling results in data?
Yeah, this is they are inter and interdependent of each
Yeah.
other. Um, you can't, so the infrastructure for telling a good story has to have the right characters in the story,
Yeah.
down to like protagonist, antagonist, and the
Character arc.
yeah,
Plot.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. You paid a lot more attention to English 101 than I did. Um, so you need the pieces. So that's the construct of storytelling. And what data does is it allows you to expose who those characters are in the story.
Mm.
And when a lot of when we deliver our insights to the partners, we were so bad at the beginning because we were like, here's here's what the data says. And it was like data science-y, and it wasn't narrative driven.
Yeah.
And what the feedback we kept getting early on was like, it needs to be something that not only we can understand how, what that means for us, but we need to be able to communicate it to our boss. We need to be able to communicate it to our colleagues. And ultimately that's what gets spread and shared, and it has an impact in our organization. And what we found is the more narrative and storytelling with the data, like the nerdy stuff, the math, with that gets shared, like then it not only is more effective for the organization, but selfishly it's more effective for us, because now they're like, whoa, where'd you learn that? Like, right. And then it's like, oh, it's these Kansas City guys. I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing cool stuff. Yeah, data just by itself, like, this is, it doesn't give you anything. You got to know what to do with it.
For sure. So from the perspective of a company, how do you feel like most companies are, quote unquote, missing the target when it comes to connecting with customers at this human level, but also data driven?
We'll start with the social media listening. I think there's been a lot of, we'll call it, like, in that world of analytics. And we've, like, there's a big cosmetics company, like top 50, Fortune 50. And they, like, straight up told us, they go, oh yeah, we do data science, or, we understand our customer. We have a whole team on social media analytics. And we were like, whoa, like, how do you tell them, like, hey, they're, and we actually have a good relationship with them now. But I think focusing too much on what is being just said on social media is a mistake. When I'm, like, giving my sales pitch, like, a big part of, like, how we describe ourselves and try to connect with that disconnect that exists is that, like, customers are customers for 1-2 seconds that they engage with your brand,
right?
But they are humans for their entire lives. And it turns out a lot of what happens in the human part of what we do as being a human affects if we become a customer or not. Mm-hmm. So you need to understand, and then I think reliance on surveys, reliance on social media as the only, and then transaction data, like, to understand the humans they sell products to, mm-hmm. is a kind of like a myopic way of looking at the problem set of who are these humans and what are their needs. But then the second thing I think that we've seen is this trust, and this, I will say, this is shifting, but this, like, general trust in big advertising firms, and they're an easy target. I know, like, their whole industry is getting shaken up because of that problem. Is they're like, hey, like, we had, I'm just the chief marketing officer. It's the advertising firm that's going out and executing all this.
Right.
And for so long, like, those two worlds were, like, really, like, tight. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to see that separate, because the brands are starting to realize that we need to we need the, like, scientific understanding of these humans, not like some whiteboard creative session understanding of these humans. We need science, and we need math, and we like, tease the art there's always going to be an art to marketing. We believe that full-heartedly, but there can be more scientific rigor to understanding the humans you sell products to. And that's what we're bringing to the table.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a couple brands out there that are, using your methodology well?
Well, all the ones we work with, but besides them, there's a couple of, I think, people we've spoken to that, so you have the world kind of divided into two ways, and we spend almost all of our partners, well, not, we do have some that are, we'll call them online. They're just online platforms, very large, like travel sites that are working with us, but they're, for the most part, I'd say that the tech world, and that's the world I come from before doing this, you're able to test things. I was reading a book, and Facebook tests A/B tests at least 1,000 times a day.
Wow.
And that's everything from like the shade of the button to the placement of, of your messenger ring. And I mean, anything you can think of, they're optimizing for addiction, right?
Right.
And that's what everyone's after, whether you're selling soup, whether you're selling for sneakers, or whether you're selling, we'll call it attention on Facebook. To answer, this is a long-winded answer, but to answer your question, I think the tech world, by default of being cheap and easy to test and understand their customers, they're not, the quest for causality is always out there, correlation versus causality, but they don't need to know why people are clicking the red button. People are clicking the red button and their sales are going up, or they're staying longer on the site. Whereas it's more important to know why in both worlds, but especially over here, to have a digital environment that you can start to behave like a Facebook, behave like a Google. Like that's a game changer for Nike or for any CPG or consumer facing company. That is a game changer. So when we are engaging with people, that's really what we're doing, is we're allowing them to start to understand their customers the same way Facebook understands their customers. And not because Facebook mines all your data, but because you can, maybe they're a bad example, but because you can run tests very, very cheaply and very iteratively to say, this is the most optimal way to accomplish what we want to accomplish.
Brendan, for someone who is in a marketing department, internally, or at an agency like we talked about, outside of contacting you guys directly for your services, what are some, general steps at a high level that these marketing teams can, start to implement to adopt the methodology that we've talked about today?
So I think the first thing I have like a list of books that I'll throw at the end that I think is important that it's less so of a, it's more like understanding humans and really, I think that the education level is where it begins, assuming that is set and, they mow through 2 years worth of reading. The other thing I would say is be more open to how can you start to test things? Like, even if it's not Lelex Prime, right? Like, how can I start to test these assumptions that I have? Because in the tech world, like, Blizzard at Google, like, they like all the really good like data scientists and engineers, they're like, we know nothing. We're just the engineers to understand what we don't know, and we're going to throw as many as smart hypotheses at this problem to then understand, what does the data say, like what does that answer. And I think it's a mindset shift from what has been the way in these companies, who, by the way, have been tremendously successful for 100 years or 50 years, but the game has changed. So now that the game has changed, like even in the last 2 years, we live in this age of information where everything that I want, like I have more access to the information associated with the type of belt to buy than humans have had in the entire history of human beings. And I have it on my phone. Yeah. So you need to be in a position to like switch how you think about trying to understand your customers and be more proactive in saying, how can we take the hypothesis that we have and treat them like hypotheses, not truths, and then test against those hypotheses to understand the best way to do whatever we want to do.
That's great advice. Let's hear 2 or 3 of those book recommendations you mentioned.
All right. Ooh, you're gonna hold me to 2.
3. I'll give you 3.
Okay, so 3. All right. So we're like at Lelex Prime. I think some of our employees, I think they like roll their eyes now when we're like, you got to read this book, because we just like mow through books. You can just, it's good for the team, but it's also like really good for just self-development.
Sure.
The first one I'd say is Laws of Human Nature. That book is opens up your, anything Robert Greene writes is a fascinating book. It opens up your understanding of the human as a human, as a Homo sapien.
Okay.
I think Sapiens is they're kind of the same, but Sapiens is also by Noah Yuval Harari. That book is like fantastic as well, and that's like really, really, if you want to get really nerdy on like how agriculture changed, how, you know, the religions we have. I mean, it's really fascinating to understand that the world, you know, in 2020, talking on Zoom, like this is a really unique point in time, and there's all this other history. And guess what? The Homo sapien is the Homo sapien that whole time. You can learn a lot about how we've behaved previously in events to see how we're going to behave now. And then I just finished, or I'm finishing a book that this week called Everybody Lies, or Everyone Lies. It's like by Seth, and then he's got like a hyphenated last name. Really, really, you want to talk about figured out how to do data storytelling, or storytelling with data. He nails it on the head. He's funny, and it also illuminates how the search for unbiased research is kind of right underneath our nose. And there's a lot that you can do to understand humans. And he walks through it all. So those are my 3, especially if you're in marketing, like those, it's so important to understand, again, the humans you're trying to motivate and
for sure.
Provide value to.
Yeah, without a doubt. Thanks for those recommendations. I'll link to those in the show notes for listeners out there. Brendan, last question: where can people best get a hold of you if they want business advice or want to employ you for your services?
Yeah, absolutely. So employ for our services, lelexprime.com, and it's Lelex Prime, like Amazon Prime. Lelexprime.com is our website. Go take a look. If you just, you know, it's my email is brendan@lelexprime.com. You can shoot me an email. But then if anyone has any personal like advice that they want, just find me on LinkedIn. It's Brendan Reilly, and it's Lelex Prime, Chief Revenue Officer at Lelex Prime.
Awesome. Brendan, well, thanks so much for your time today and all the insights you provided. I know a lot of people will be digging into those books.
Cool. Yeah. Read up. You can only contact me. Contact me if you want to use our business for services, but only contact me if you've read one of the books, because then probably a lot of the advice you're going to ask me, I'm just going to tell you whatever I read. So
awesome.
Good on that.
Cool. Well, Brendan, thanks so much for your time.
Yeah. Cheers. All right. See ya.
That wraps up today's episode. We hope to have brought you some valuable key takeaways. Most importantly, whatever you learned, take action on it. Apply it to your life. Apply it to your career. Motivation and inspiration only come as a result of taking that first step. So if you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe on whichever platform you found the show. You can also follow us on all the major social media platforms, or contact us directly at genwhyleaders@gmail.com. That's GENWHY leaders@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Eric Huey, and thanks for listening to the Gen Y Leaders Podcast.